Thanks, Alex. Okay, what I want to talk about today, I actually just want to share some of the findings from the research that I've been doing, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity. Thank you for the invitation, because this is really just coming together. I'm just putting together a book out of this work, and this is one of my first chances to talk to people about it, so I'm pleased to be able to do it. The work is on young people and their negotiation of cultural diversity in Australia, looking at multicultural neighbourhoods, and instead of taking a kind of ethnic group approach, looking at neighbourhoods as places or spaces where people come together of many different backgrounds and figure out how to get along or not. Now, we're all aware that we are in the midst of a kind of backlash against multiculturalism, and we're seeing increasing calls for things like social cohesion, core values, consensus, the kinds of things that bring us together. And what I want to tell you about today is how the work that I've done with these young people starts to complicate this assumption that we need to move towards this idea of a socially cohesive togetherness. They offer some very different ways of thinking about successful multicultural communities that really complicate those assumptions. Now, of course, there's a lot of worry about young people. There's always worry about young people, but particularly young people of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, in amidst these debates about the supposed failure of multiculturalism to entrench this kind of togetherness. And what I want to suggest today is that it's important to look at young people's everyday practices and their experiences to start to dispel some of those anxieties, but also think carefully about how a new generation, without being too optimistic or idealistic about this, but how this new generation of young people might be thinking about multicultural citizenship, and particularly advancing things beyond an assumption that social cohesion is the next step forward. From a theoretical perspective, I guess what I'm wanting to press is the limits of the more conservative, communitarian, social cohesion approaches, especially ones that are very dependent on ideas about consensus, shared values, and an absence of conflict. So let me tell you a little bit about the research, and then I'll give you some examples of these young people's insights into the ways that they negotiate community life. So I had a couple of different funding sources. What I did was I looked at 5 different cities in Australia and then focused on neighbourhoods that were known for their cultural diversity. And a total of 107 young people across these cities were interviewed, so about 20 per city. I won't tell you about all the neighbourhoods, and partly because I'm not wanting to identify them because of some of the things that these young people were talking about that contribute to a kind of stigmatising discourse about their neighbourhoods. So this is a sort of composite profile of these suburbs. So we can see they're very culturally diverse. A lot of people living there born overseas. A lot of them speak languages other than English. And as often goes with cultural diversity, you get a particular socioeconomic profile of higher than average unemployment levels, lower than average family incomes. Something else that was interesting about the neighbourhoods, which I didn't factor in but sort of presented itself, was the dominance of young people, particularly those aged 15 to 25. So we're seeing very diverse, fairly disadvantaged, very young neighbourhoods grappling with these issues. The participants themselves, like I said, I'm not focusing on particular ethnic groups. This was meant to be a sort of a snapshot, a grab at these particular neighbourhoods. There was a fairly even gender split. Most of them were aged between 18 and 20. Most of them were born overseas, but having said that, even the overseas-born cohort had spent most of their post-childhood lives in Australia. So they've kind of grown up here. And we get a whole range of countries of birth, a whole range of cultural identifications, a lot of hybridising of identity. So there are young people of immigrant background, refugee background, 1.5, second, third, as well as long-standing populations, including Indigenous and Anglo, and a spread of religious affiliations, although we see a bunching around those two major ones. So I asked them about a whole lot of things, but the extent and the nature of their intercultural relations, so where they mixed, how they mixed, the ways that they use their local spaces, their communities, their strategies for and feelings about belonging, and their attitudes towards national identity. So I'm not going to go into all of this now, obviously. What I want to think about really is this idea of community and what community means to these young people. Now, as I've suggested, social cohesion has emerged recently as a kind of new way forward, I guess, beyond multiculturalism in terms of managing cultural diversity. And I'd suggest that this has been part of a turn against multiculturalism, especially when we get as a kind of a fix to parallel lives, too much recognition of minority rights, the remedy, which is a focus on core values or community harmony. Now, there are lots of different interpretations of social cohesion, but from this conservative perspective, it's about focusing on the community, seeing this very much as a singular and bounded entity that functions best when people get along, share some values that are the community's values, and experience an absence of conflict. Now, there's been a lot of criticism, obviously, of social cohesion by a number of eminent theorists, so I'm not going to cover all of that ground. It tends to be fairly general. It's certainly not always related to young people. So what I want to do is now turn to how this approach kind of fails to match up with the experiences of young people in terms of their everyday life in their local areas. And there are two things I want to highlight today. One is this idea of a shared sense of community, and the other is the disavowal of conflict. So, social cohesion focuses on creating a shared sense of place through mutual engagement in local civic life. What my research has found, though, is that for these young people, there are actually highly contested ideas about community that make shared attachment really very difficult. These young people often experience community as a physically divided space. They had a strong sense of belonging in some places and a sense of exclusion in other places. So especially those who are visibly different often felt under surveillance in particular spaces around their community or unwelcome. So the barriers to their engagement in local civic life weren't just about their own reluctance or needing to understand that there are cultural differences in the ways that we use our neighbourhood, but very real practices of structural exclusion based not only on racism but on age. So being a visibly different young person meant something in particular neighbourhoods. Now, at the same time, they weren't angels, they weren't just victims of these processes. They often engaged in exclusionary processes themselves, particularly around what I'd call a kind of territorialising of their local space. So they talked a lot about streets or spaces where some young people were welcome and others weren't. There were some fights, there were disputes over turf. So there was a sense that different young people with different orientations and tastes would use the neighbourhood space in different ways, and you had to be alert to those differences. So I think this starts to complicate this idea of shared attachment to local places, the foundation of cohesive communities. So let me just give you some examples. These are some quotes. So we started to talk about, what are these divisions between people? What causes them? This is one young woman, she said she thought it was issues to do with space. People think that they own, in a way, a particular part, that sort of thing, like a street or an area. Another young man who was involved in the research, he was talking about the difference between seeing this as kind of ethnic conflict and spatial conflict. He said it's not so much between Samoans and the Tongans around here. There are a few Samoan guys, they get on fine, but it's more neighbourhood X against neighbourhood Y. So he's saying it's not about ethnicity, it's about space. This is a group of young women of African background, and they're kind of normalising this conflict that goes on between young people about space. They say, there was this stuff happening with, and they're talking about a neighbourhood, so a particular, neighbourhood boys, yes, the X boys, the Y boys, the Z boys, that's a while ago. There was tension and stuff like that. That's normal. And it is, it's normal. And then what says back in the days, ex-boys wouldn't come into my neighbourhood because it's their territory. They don't want to share it with anyone else. They're trying to protect that area. Now, I think we get very worried about the idea of interethnic conflict amongst young people. There's an assumption that this kind of territorialising is caused by ethnic divisions. But these young people had much more subtle explanations for conflict. They were really keen to refute the idea that there were these long-standing enmities between ethnic groups. They talked about the highly contingent nature of conflict and the ways that just the momentary backup of friends or family could give the appearance of an ethnic dispute. They also, interestingly, exhibited quite a lot of intercultural knowledge. They had huge competency. So I think this suggests that they don't actually need to get to know one another better, which is often an assumption of social cohesion initiatives. They already knew each other quite well, and what they were fighting over was limited resources as well as recognition. An example of this young woman is talking about some hassles that were going on between Indigenous youth and African background youth in her neighbourhood. But she was really at pains to point out she felt that this wasn't about creating a kind of racial hierarchy, which was the way she was very frustrated. She felt that youth and community workers, police, elders had constructed the conflict as though this is what it was about. She said, I don't think the Africans look down on Indigenous. I don't think the Indigenous look down. I think it's definitely a territorial thing. It's more a territory thing than really about the race. It's really a territory thing. And also the Indigenous feel like we're having it easy. It's been given to us. A privileged thing. You have it, why don't we? That sort of attitude. You guys are having it all and we have to struggle, we have to fight. We still don't have it. They think we have it. They tell you, some people have said to us, you have it easy. What are you doing here, taking what belongs to us? It's been given to you. Now, there's a whole lot of things we could say about this quote, and I'm mindful of Val and Farida's work, looking at some of these issues in Perth. But I think what we're seeing here, that territorialising and conflict isn't just driven by simplistic ethnic difference, but there are subcultural allegiances going on. There's a sense of exclusion from the adult-controlled public space that's forcing young people into fighting over the limited shared space they have, and a desire to claim power as well as resources in light of both their relative powerlessness and also their struggles for recognition on the part of the state. What does all of this mean for cohesive community building? Well, I think, and I'm building on the work of the UK geographer Ash Amin in this respect, a shared sense of community in terms of a shared sense of place becomes an unrealistic goal in these circumstances. So instead of demanding achievements of consensus or community, policy really needs to be looking at openings for dialogue and contact amongst people as equals within a neighbourhood's many spaces. So acknowledging that a neighbourhood isn't a single thing. Ash Amin notes that the community cohesion agenda, as it's known in the UK, promotes the pursuit of a unitary sense of place in ways that disregard or problematise these kinds of practices of territorialising, the sorts of competitions and negotiations that young people are involved in every day over ownership of place. And this is certainly what these young people are reporting. This is what their everyday reality is, but it doesn't necessarily undermine their equal capacity to kind of get along with one another. And I think we have to keep that in mind. So related to the idea of contested space is a second way in which their experiences, I think, really fail to match up with the social cohesion agenda. And this is around conflict and consensus. So social cohesion is very much about peaceful cohabitation through conflict reduction and the engendering of consensus. What these young people reported was actually a high level of everyday mixing that included an acceptance of and a kind of refusal to panic about conflict, about difference, about discord. And for some of them, what actually made their communities work was the presence of productive discord. So not agreement, not what they had in common, but the ability to argue well together. Now, there's a high level of concern, as I've already suggested, about inter-ethnic fighting amongst young people. They really took issue with that view. They described a lot of the territorialising that went on as highly contingent, was often really performative, as able to coexist with long-standing intercultural friendships. They also made clear how contingent and contextualised conflict could be. So obviously conflict was operating alongside mix. It didn't destroy convivial relations. It had a place there somehow. At the same time, so they weren't shying away from the reality of conflict, but they didn't necessarily see it as a problem in itself. And we have to be careful about what we're defining as kind of good and bad conflict, but they're certainly making a case for some kinds of productive conflict as being beneficial if it occurs within a context of mutual respect. So most of the communities where these young people lived were experienced positively when there was this capacity for people to make and negotiate space for one another, to treat others and be treated as entitled to be there. And that was even when it led to practices that are usually deemed very damaging to cohesion, such as clashes or indifference. And there was quite a lot of what I and others have called a kind of ethical indifference going on, as well as some of this conflict. So I'm just giving you an example of this focus on kind of productive disagreement. This is Nicole. She said her diverse community worked well because people had actually learnt to argue well together. She said you get a lot more out of it. You're not just so narrow-minded. You might not agree. Like when you get into conversation, you may not agree with some of the things they say, but at least you're open-minded. You've spoken about their beliefs and maybe their traditions that are different to ours. It just gives you a little bit of awareness, I guess, and I like that. This is another participant who also supported this view that the capacity to argue and argue productively was a better form of community than the achievement of agreement. He said, I think the hardest thing about living with people of different communities is also the best thing about it. In fact, you have to actually learn to appreciate and respect different cultures, faiths, political views. You don't have to agree with them, you don't have to love them, but in order to live here and live amongst people in a harmonious way, you've got to respect it and in a way understand it. You hang out with people from different places with different views, you sit down and have a chat and you start arguing about something. And you don't want to look like a fool who's arguing about something that you don't know. So I think he's making a kind of case for respect and a form of understanding of difference to construct community, but not to achieve unanimity or sameness, but to be able to have a productive argument. You know, he wants to stand up well in the argument, know what he's talking about. So being able to know and recognise others is accepting their rights and differences. It's not about creating non-conflictual relationships. What's also relevant here is that community doesn't have to rest on just good feelings or a sense of closeness with others. So a lot of the young people talked about this sense of feeling comfortable and like they belonged in their community or their neighbourhood because they knew other people or they felt safe with other people, even while they didn't really like them. So here are two examples. One guy says, everybody knows everybody around here, whether you like each other or not, it's a different thing. A young woman says, I feel comfortable anywhere. She's talking about in her neighbourhood, not anything bigger than that. It's just like I said, with some of the different groups, I wouldn't really mingle with them, but it doesn't mean I wouldn't feel safe. So these are just examples of how some of these young people are articulating forms of community that don't rely upon consensus, sameness, shared sense of attachment, or purely good feelings. I think in order to take seriously the ways that many young people are experiencing and constructing everyday multicultural publics and shaping civic life, we really need to think beyond this cohesion agenda that relies upon an ideal of homogenous, continuous, stable community where we share values and all manage to get along. I think young people are indicating there are other forms of associational life going on. They're constructing new forms of sociality that we have to somehow take account of. And I think the insights they give into local community making suggest that we don't have to hang on to these ideas about consensus, homogeneity, good feelings. We can have contingent, multidimensional communities. In fact, we already do. And in this sense, I think, as some of the other speakers have pointed out, the practice has far exceeded the policy. Successful multicultural communities are actually going on all the time, and we need to try and get our heads around how we might start to theorise and then make policy from that direction. Thanks.
Thank you for that talk. I'm sure everyone would appreciate the importance of such research to really have sort of solid sort of empirical perspectives on a lot of these arguments that we're making. I think we can open it up to a few questions now. We still have about 5 minutes worth of questions. Yep.
If I could try to draw the empirical to the theoretical, essentially your work connects really closely with democratic theory. If you have too much harmony too much cohesiveness. It's not good for democracy. I mean, democracy itself requires some grist of conflict. So then the question becomes what sorts of conflict, the manner in which conflict is conducted. And some of your respondents seem to be very astute in understanding that there are certain norms. You kept saying some of your interlocutors needed to be versed in making the best argument. This is really positive in terms of the norms of the Department of Immigration and so on, to government authorities. So there's really close connections between what's going on the ground and the very ideals, it seems to me, of a successful multicultural polity. Which I don't know if you work with sort of democratic theory, notions of different kinds of democracy, but it's available. That's my point.
Yeah, thank you. No, that is helpful. And especially when you start to think about conflict and what is productive conflict and the idea of, like an agonistic form of democracy where people can actually get into useful debates, and it's not about reaching a point of agreement, but recognising, hearing one another, creating a space where that can occur. I think what complicates this picture is there's a whole lot of unproductive conflict that goes on as well. We can't shy away from that. So how do we create the spaces and the resources that allow young people to do these better forms of engagement in a situation where many of them are also often at the same time still grappling with what we might think of as conflict that doesn't benefit anybody in its escalation.
Anna?
I guess what you just said, Anita, leads into the question I was going to ask you is about do you think that young people would benefit from programs of like non-violent conflict resolution and things like that? Again, what was said in the first presentation, the importance of developing intercultural literacy and interreligious literacy. Is that perhaps something that your research is also pointing towards, that creating skills to negotiate these spaces non-violently but discursively and democratically? Is that needed, do you think? More of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what came out of the research, because a lot of them are really sick of being put in rooms and told to get to know one another, and it's all about cultural difference and you need to understand. They actually understood each other really well. They knew a lot about different cultures. I mean, they lived with them every day. So I think when it's very much about, and especially about people of minority background talking to others of minority background, at the moment that's where it seems a lot of the funding goes. These intercultural programs to get Muslims and Indigenous kids together or whatever it might be. When they weren't convinced, and I'm not either, that's where the issues are. I think there was a feeling that wasn't cutting it, but certainly stuff around conflict resolution and the kind of peace work that young people felt they were already doing, how to scale that up and have that recognised. There was a lot of support for that.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'm afraid we don't have any more time for questions. We have to get on to afternoon tea. We have 15 minutes for afternoon tea. So if you have any more questions, I'm sure everyone will have a lot to ask. You can ask me on the break. Thank you.